O God, though my words will be spoken today, may only your word be heard. Amen.
Amen.
Please make yourselves comfortable. When I was preparing for ordination, I completed a unit of clinical pastoral education while serving as a chaplain at the Seafarers Ministry of the Golden Gate at the Port of Oakland. I spent most of my time going out to the container ships that were berthed and offered to spend some time with the ship's crews. Very early in my time there, I remember walking up the gangway and meeting a young officer from Ukraine who was on his last day of an 11-month contract. As we talked, I learned that during that time, due to his company's COVID restrictions, he had been confined to the vessel and had never gone ashore. Not even one single walk down the gangway to place a foot on the dock. And what started as a 6-month contract kept getting extended by the company to the maximum time, 11 months before the company had to release him under international law. The stress and strain on his face were visible as we talked, and we spoke of disappointment and frustration with being kept longer and longer before he could go home. Missing family, birthdays, a wedding, and as the first officer on the vessel, the stress of his work was significant. I remember asking him how he did it. How did he manage to endure as long as he did, and what brought him hope? He offered that trying to stay patient was part of it. He also said that having a Ukrainian crew helped because being from the same country, they shared a culture and they could support one another, particularly at a time when home was a war zone. And he said the promise of knowing that eventually he would get home, eventually that they would get home together, gave him hope. He and his crew were at sea, but they were also trapped in a kind of desert. Deserts can be literal or metaphorical. In the desert, we are confronted with scarcity and a deep and necessary dependence on one another. Without our companions on the journey through the desert, we might not make it. In the desert, the familiar is absent and we are tested by scarcity, the expanse of seemingly endless absence and the struggle for survival, be it physical, spiritual, or psychological. In the desert, one must have a will to survive, some creativity, and a bit of stubbornness. After my clinical pastoral education program ended, Eileen and I got out of town and visited Joshua Tree National Park. And I was enchanted the moment we started driving through the park. As we stopped a few places and hiked out to points of interest, it was hot and arid, even in the late spring. I was amazed by the will of things to live in the desert. I was reminded about the abundance that can be found in the midst of seeming scarcity, and of the ways that life finds a way out of no way. Plants growing through crevices and boulders, animals seeking the shade of rock formations, all during the scorching daytime hours. Deserts are also places of transformation. Deserts are places that can change us. The story of God's people, Israel, included following God's invitation to find liberation through the desert, journeying for nearly 40 years before they settled in the land that God had promised them. Eventually, the nation Israel would succumb to a greater power that destroyed the temple and sent her people into their Babylonian captivity, where for nearly 3 generations they were away from home, held again in captivity and longing for what seemed to be unfulfilled promises. They yearned for God's promises to be fulfilled again. You may remember the lament in Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept. when we remembered Zion. That psalm and the Babylonian captivity would become the centerpiece of Frederick Douglass's work, What to the Slave is the 4th of July? Like enslaved people in the United States, the Judeans held in captivity in Babylon needed to remind one another during their desert experience of the promises that God made to them. They needed to be reminded of the liberating work that God was doing for them, because in the midst of this arid desert experience, it may not have always been apparent, particularly after this went on generation after generation. The people needed to be reminded about God's faithfulness. The prophet Baruch gives us one of those reminders of the redeeming work of God, of the lengths that God will go to keep God's promises to God's people. God's movement may not be on the timeline we all might hope for, because human hearts are involved. But God remains faithful to God's people through their journey. As the story goes, just as God's people were delivered through the parting waters of the Red Sea, the Babylonian captivity would end and God's people would be returned to their homeland, for God has ordered that every high mountain and the everlasting hills be made low and the valleys filled up, to make level ground so that Israel may walk safely in the glory of God. Baruch reminds us that God is always doing something new, even in the deserts of our lives. Life is being renewed and restored in the midst of the desert, even in the face of death. And it is from the desert, from the wilderness of the desert, that God moves anew and renews God's people. Not from the usual places, suspects, not through the religious authorities or the elites of the time, but from the voices that speak to us from the wilderness. A man named John emerging from the desert and the wilderness to point the way to God's continued movement in the lives of God's people. Deserts are places where clarity can be found and where a deep understanding of our connection to one another and the earth can be appreciated. Deserts can be places where, through a kind of refining, we gain clarity about ourselves and about what is true. Deserts can provide us opportunities to appreciate the realities of the cycle of life and death, what is essential to the life God promises and what is not. And the desert can be a place where we focus our attention on distractions. There is nothing to distract us from how and where God is moving in our midst. These days, it can seem as if we are all journeying through a desert. I think we're feeling a kind of aridness. We are reminded that this is exactly where every high mountain and the everlasting hills will be made low and the valleys filled up, to make level ground so that God's people may walk safely in the glory of God. This is where God is to listen for the voices in our wilderness. The voices that come to us from neglected communities and forgotten people. The voices of our siblings from the First Nations. The voices of LGBTQ people. The voices of working people and underprivileged communities. The voices of women and young people and people of color and people in war-torn parts of the world, and so many others. As the world of power and money and privilege might seek to drown out. These are the voices crying out, and even louder now, pointing our way home, the liberation of all of God's people. In the desert, God is moving and making new things, new ways for God's people. Listen to the voices crying out and showing us the way home from our connection. The way home toward the well springs of abundant life for all of God's people together. Amen.